You're listening to WPPM LP Philadelphia, 106.5 FM. I'm your host, Tara Lake, bringing you a special conversation with artist T.D. Anderson, whose two-panel painting, Pietà, Woman Behold Your Son, Behold Your Mother, features Mamie Till-Mobley and speaks powerfully to our current conversations on racial justice. Mamie Till-Mobley was the mother of Emmett Till, an African-American Chicago teenager who was lynched in Money, Mississippi in August 1955 at the age of 14. T.D. Anderson is based in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old African-American emergency room technician at the University of Louisville Health, was killed by plainclothes police officers in her home as she slept in March 2020. Pietà, Woman Behold Your Son, Behold Your Mother, can be viewed at www.tdandersonart.com. T.D. Anderson, an artist, reverend, and teaching elder for the Presbyterian Church USA, is here to speak with us about a beautiful two-panel series that she has offered us in such a pivotal and critical time. And it's called Pietà, Woman, Behold Your Son, Behold Your Mother. And for those of you who are going to be able to take a look at the video that we hope to share with you, you can see those gorgeous panels behind T.D. Anderson that she so generously brought to share with us today. So, T.D. Anderson, how are you today? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm pretty good today.
Good. And I have to tell you, I had an opportunity to see your artwork because in several networks that I frequent, there was a great deal of buzz and discussion about your work. And I couldn't believe I hadn't come across you before. And I thought that our listeners here, you're listening to 106.5 FM, WPPM LP Philadelphia. And I thought that our listeners, especially here in Philadelphia, who have been so active in the racial and social justice movements that have been so much a part of our world in 2020, that our discussions around the senseless loss of too many African-American men and women this year, that you gave us at once a beautiful history lesson, but also a moment to reflect on the very painful present. And you did so in such a poignant way. So I want to get into this right away and talk about what brought you to this work. So could you give us a little bit of background in any way that you would like in terms of what brought you to present this work to us and paint this gorgeous work, Pietà, Woman, Behold Your Son, Behold Your Mother?
Absolutely. So 2020 has been a year. There is often the juxtaposition of the COVID-19 crisis and the continuing, I'll say, practice at this point of extrajudicially killing Black people in the United States. Those have been positioned as dual pandemics. And my job, I serve as denominational staff for the Presbyterian Church USA, doing racial justice, helping push that work throughout the church. And so I couldn't help but just wrestle with the fact that in the midst of a public health crisis, Black people were once again getting the short end of the stick. And as much as everything was halted by the pandemic in our lives, one thing the pandemic could not stop was George Floyd, was Breonna Taylor, was Ahmaud Arbery. And in addition to everyone that we've lost either to police shootings, extrajudicial killings, and coronavirus infections, we also lost John Lewis this year.
Yes.
And in his op-ed that he shared posthumously, he talked about how, for him, his George Floyd, his Breonna Taylor, his Rayshard Brooks was Emmett Till. And that happened in 1955. And so I am a minister. I have a background in arts. My undergraduate degree is in art. And for me, one of the most cathartic things that I can do in the midst of grief and trauma is to create. And so I picked up paintbrushes. I hadn't painted for years. It had been quite some time since I had painted something. And so I just started painting again and coming back to that discipline and coming back to that catharsis of painting. And I thought so much about Mamie Till-Mobley and what she did in the aftermath of her son's lynching and how that changed everything, and yet also so much still remains the same. So I felt like if for John Lewis, Emmett Till was his George Floyd, and yet we still have a George Floyd in 2020, somebody's not listening. This woman went through so much to tell this story so that things could change, and so much did change. But clearly we need the lesson again. And I just wanted to find a way to center this woman and the power in what she did. I felt like we needed to revisit that story.
Thank you so much. And it was that's really powerful what you said, that someone's not been listening. That despite what's interesting is Mamie Till-Mobley became, I believe, this this image or this template for what it means to enact African American motherhood as activism. That to raise and rear African American children as an African American woman by itself is a revolutionary act. But then for Till-Mobley to make the decision to allow her son's death to become, and to allow the murder of her son, the senseless extrajudicial murder of her son, to become to become a moment that she was willing to share with the broader African American community, with the broader country, and with the world. Not only because she allowed Jet Magazine to be in that space with her in those difficult moments, but also because she continued that activism throughout her life. Can you tell us more about Mamie Till-Mobley as the subject of your painting, and then also just in terms of, you tell us so much at your website, tdandersonart.com. But and by the way, I have to stop here and say that one of the most moving aspects of the way that you present this work to us is the framing those works within essays and within sermons that you write to accompany the pieces at tdandersonart.com. But could you tell us more about why Mamie Till-Mobley and what it is that we need to know about her? You frame that so beautifully in reminding us of Congressman John Lewis's words. But what do we need to know? What do we need to know about Mamie Till-Mobley and her work and her meaning for us?
I've just been struck by Mrs. Till-Mobley's generosity and courage in sharing just such a horrific episode in her life and the life of her family. I also feel a lot of resentment that she had to, and that so many other mothers had to. This woman, I dove into her story. She has a book that was released after her death, her memoir, Death of Innocence, the story of the hate crime that changed the world. And so I read her story and fell in love with her. Just as a mother figure, as a mother of the community, as a Black woman, listening to how she came into her own and all of the stuff she had to go through to get this boy into the world, right? Like, he was born breech. His umbilical cord was wrapped in such a way that it threatened his ability to walk. in the future. The doctors thought that he wouldn't walk. He was able to walk. He was able to overcome so much. He contracted polio at a young age, and he survived it, but it gave him, as you know, a stutter, a speech impediment. And she coached him through that. She came up, and she wasn't formally educated in education until later, until after his death. But she had the wherewithal to come up with counseling strategies to help her son manage the stutter that polio had left him with. He had become a protector for her. He had seen her through a really abusive marriage and was very much his mother's protector and provider. And this is a young man who I know she had to go through so much in life. I mean, I'm a mother too. I'm a mother of a little Black girl, and there's a lot we have to navigate in our parenting. And she went through so much to make sure that he would become an upstanding member of the community, and then had that taken away. And this is a woman who all her life played by the rules and did everything that she was told she should do. And she broke all of those rules. Once the world broke its social contract with her, she broke the contract with it. She said, I'm not playing nice anymore. I mean, these are not, of course, her words, but these were her actions. Everything changed for her in that moment. She talks about feeling this energy transfer from her mother, who had been the rock of the family and who had been the strong one that kept everybody in line. And so then that had to be her. She had to keep everybody in line. She had to tell everybody exactly what was going to happen. She had to tell A.A. Rayner, the funeral home, no, open casket, don't work on him. Send him to this church. She didn't consult with the pastors, which as a pastor sort of like made my heart beat. But I understand it, and I would hope that I would have the sort of wherewithal to understand what was happening in that moment, to go with that. But this is a woman who stopped seeking permission. And in that fraught freedom that she came into in that moment, she got the world's attention. There's something incredibly powerful about that to me. And so I was just in love with her, and I wanted to send to her and tell her story.
That's so important. And I want to correct something that I said a moment ago. It wasn't an extrajudicial killing. This was a hate crime. There wasn't Emmett Till did not commit a crime.
Right.
He was murdered. He was murdered because of an interest among people to keep this shining, brilliant young boy from Chicago, and the symbol of his presence in this small Mississippi town. They wanted to erase that and eradicate that. It's a hate crime. So I apologize for having misspoken. And I thank you so much too for helping us to understand the importance of Mamie Till-Mobley's work into the 21st century, by the way, that she found ways to share her pain and her anguish with the community, and that she also found ways to document her experience, and that she also went on to become an educator who touched so many young lives, and that she was able to turn the pain of having lost her own child into an opportunity to be a beacon, not just in her family, but in the broader community as an educator. I want to talk about the works themselves, and I really wanted to spend some time with them because they are at once compelling and beautiful. There's something about your technique that is at once journalistic and also surreal, surreal and in its storytelling, but then also it has a way of transporting us into the moment. You do that so beautifully with both these pieces, and I want you to tell us more about the pieces themselves, more about your engagement with the jet photography of these moments. Could you tell us more about that?
Wow. And also, I'm really humbled by your commentary on the pieces. So this piece is in the style of a Pietà, which is a religious motif in art, mainly European art, Renaissance era art, that depicts the pain of the Virgin Mary, or she wasn't virgin by that time, but Mother Mary, as she embraced the body of her slain son, Jesus, after he's been crucified. It's called the piety or the pity. That's literally what it means. And I talk about how this whole year has felt like a Good Friday experience. It's felt like that. And there's a portion in John's gospel where Jesus calls out to his mother and says, "Woman, behold your son." And, there's not really any indication who he's talking about when he says your son. She's probably thinking that he's speaking of himself. And so what does it mean to look at your dying child as they are unjustly dying or have unjustly died? And when I think about what it took from Mamie Till-Mobley to go and collect her son's body, knowing what has happened to him, and to deliberately look at that form. And in her memoir, she talks about that process and where she had to go and how clinically she had to approach it just so she could stay present in the moment, and how she had to start at his feet and work her way up. Like, where do you have to go to do that? And so in the panel, and this is a diptych. Diptychs are usually attached. They're not attached, but these are two paintings that are to be viewed as one piece, one cohesive piece. So in the first panel, "Woman, behold your son," I take that Jet magazine footage, which includes a lot more than what I've painted, by the way. It includes Emmett's dressed body. And I focus, I tighten in on her and try to really communicate both the gravity and the weight of that grief, but also the fact that she has to steel herself to even be there in that moment, because she had so many people standing at the ready, either telling her that she shouldn't do it because, nobody should do that, or just waiting for her to collapse. So I wanted to talk about how she steels herself. I wanted to show how she steels herself in that moment. And you talked about the sort of surrealistic element of the pieces in that particular panel too. There are these depictions of these sort of forms, and they come from an interview that she gave where she talked about an encounter she had the night she learned about Emmett's fate. An encounter that she understands to be a conversation with God. And she's arguing with God, like angry, like, why did this have to happen? And she, as she tells it, she understands that God told her, okay, I need you to understand that Emmett was my son and not yours. You were there to raise him. His job is done. My son, and this is a Christian woman talking, my son came so that people would have a way toward eternal life. Your son came so that people would have a choice as to what kind of people they would be. And again, we need to be presented with this choice anew because we're still choosing the wrong way. But it is interesting to me that she says that this voice told her, I may have taken one child from you, but I'll give you thousands. So that, who are the thousands though? They could be, because she never had any more children biologically. So they could be the kids that she taught. They could be other children who met similar fates. They could be Tamir Rice. They could be Trayvon Martin. Her children could be other mothers like her, Leslie McSpadden, Sabrina Fulton, Tamika Palmer. So many people are her children. How many more children does she need in those latter categories, though? Is my question. Like, who are the kids and why are there so many of them? Why are there thousands? So that, and there's a portion of the painting where Emmett would have been depicted, but I didn't depict that. That's just white paint right there. And I talk about the social construction of whiteness that creates these societal norms that makes allegedly whistling at a white woman a capital offense, and allows that woman's relatives to be judge, jury, and executioner. And so the second panel is not from Jet Magazine, it's from Chicago Sun-Times footage, where, and they happen in reverse chronological order. This piece is actually when she greets the body as it comes to the train station, and she sees it, and she talks about the weight of those boxes on her, like she's feeling it as she's just looking at the boxes, and she collapses under that weight. And so this is a depiction of that moment, but also the emptiness around her in that moment, because she's surrounded by people, but none of them can take away this grief for her. So there's this inherent loneliness in grief. There's also this opportunity in that emptiness around her. Like, can you step into this? Can you step in and support the Mamie Till-Mobleys that continue to happen? Like, who are you going to be in this moment? And then there's also just the loneliness of her having to go out on a limb and fight against everybody around her. Even as she had so much support around her, she had to fight just to get him home. She had to argue people down just to have that open casket funeral. That open casket funeral that, by the way, pulled the curtain back on what was happening to Black folks in the South. Everything she fought for in those days effected a change. And had she listened to any one of them, I'm not sure what would have become of us. Who would we be?
Thank you so much. I wonder how many of those children would you say were children of the civil rights movement, those children who risked their safety, children like John Lewis, and younger children who participated in children's marches and who were locked up and held in dungeons in Lee County, Georgia, and were murdered while praying in church basements. Thank you, T.D. Anderson, for helping us to think about who those children are, what their fates are, and the questions that we need to be asking about that as well. So we have these two images, one from Jet Magazine, one from the Chicago Sun-Times. In each case, one of the things that strikes the viewer in this, and I used an improper term earlier, I called it a series. It's a diptych. Thank you. And so now, as we are looking at these two panels, one of the things that strikes us is your utilization of color. Could you talk to us about, and the other interesting thing too, I think, is even the detailing that you choose in the presentation of Mamie Till-Mobley. So I wonder if you might be able to talk about that and why you made the decisions about color that you did.
Absolutely. So in both panels, Mrs. Till-Mobley is the only figure who is rendered in full color and in full detail. And I do this as a means, if you're able to see color, you understand on a different level that she is then the focus, right? If everything around her is monochrome and she is the one in color, that puts a specific focus on her. And I really wanted to center her. I was very intentional about centering her in this story. Also, rendering her in color communicates her Blackness. It makes very plain that this is a Black woman, and all of this is happening to Black people. This is a crime against a Black child and his Black family. He was lynched because he was Black. I want to be very specific about that. And so I wanted to depict as much as possible her Blackness in this. So I wanted to make sure that we understand that this is a Black woman. Her Blackness is important to the story. The crime against her child was committed against him for no other reason than the fact that he was Black. I also want to talk about how we really need to listen to Black women. And so I need to make it very, very clear that her Blackness is of import here. Mm. Her mothering is of import here. And so she is centered through color and through composition. In the first panel where Mr. Mobley is behind her, whom she later married after Emmett's death, I didn't want to just ignore his grief. This is a father figure to Emmett. And so I wanted to give some care to his depiction as well. He, in the reference photo, he is staring very pointedly at the camera, and it's almost as if he's staring at us. And his gaze into the lens of the camera really does pull us in. And I wanted us to be pulled in by his grief as well. In the second panel, everyone else is an outline. Again, there's this ethereal quality to just rendering people in outlines, but also it communicates that emptiness that I talked about earlier, the emptiness of grief, the emptiness of loneliness, the emptiness of horror, but also the emptiness of opportunity. We can step in, we can be those figures around her who hold her up and make sure that there are no more Mamie Till-Mobleys.
Thank you so much for that. I'm your host, Tara Lake, and you're listening to a special conversation with artist T.D. Anderson at WPPM LP Philadelphia, 106.5 FM. T.D. Anderson, you have shared so many things for us to think about in this moment. And I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier in the interview, earlier in your response. You said that one of the most important decisions that Mamie Till-Mobley is making in this moment is choosing to, in presenting her son in his open casket for all to see, that she was also pulling back the curtain on what was happening to African Americans in the South. Could you talk about the importance of that in 1955? Why was that so critical?
Absolutely. Well, we have to understand too that where she was sending her son in Mississippi, there was not widespread access to telephone lines, to television. The disparities in communication access between North and South were huge. Emmett Till was not the only Emmett Till. This was happening repeatedly, and there were years of history of lynchings of Black folks. And whereas it was understood as de rigueur and an accepted and feared reality for Black folks in the South, Black folks in the North, who were probably a generation or so away from the Great Migration and whose families didn't really talk about that stuff because they left it behind in the South when they left the South, and also white populations and the dominant culture probably did not understand the extent to which Black folks in the South had been terrorized. So the difference here to me is that this happened to a Chicago boy whose mom had access to newspapers, to telephones, to television, to politicians. The folks around her were incredibly well connected. And what that all allowed for was this portal into the realities of Black folks in the South being opened up through communication vehicles that never paid attention to them before, never really reported on them before. And that is due in no small part to Jet Magazine and the fact that Black folks were now in positions of publishing their own communications around what was of import to our communities. So for me, Emmett Till highlights the issue of communication justice. And we see it happening here in 2020, where if you are in incredibly rural and economically depressed areas, you probably don't have access to broadband internet speeds to be able to do your schooling. In my denomination, we have some rural churches who they're not meeting on Zoom because they can't. They don't have the internet access for it. So communication, access to communication is a justice matter. There was an incident that's somewhat famous now that happened in Monroe, North Carolina, which was much more rural. Just a few years after that, to two little boys who were imprisoned because a white female playmate had kissed them both on the cheek, and her mama got mad and got the whole community on them. Well, my father is from Monroe, North Carolina. He never knew anything about that. He was a kid at the time. He would have been 10 years old at the time that happened, and he never knew anything about it. And he was right there. So just this communication disparities allow for a shroud to be put over, or a pall rather, to be placed over the horrific realities of oppressed communities. And what Mrs. Till-Mobley's actions did was remove that pall. It opened that curtain and gave access to information to people who had no choice now but to pay attention. They preempted I Love Lucy to give the news about Emmett Till's death. And by the way, she received death threats for that, but they couldn't ignore it.
So important. So several things. Thank you so much for that. And your discussion of, I think the term that you used not long ago was communication justice, and the importance of communication justice to communities today, to African-American communities, not just in 1955, but these conversations are important, were critically important in 2015 in St. Louis, for example, and are critically important in this moment. So several things. I thought that it was really important what you talked about as Chicago as an epicenter of the African-American press in the 20th century. And those of you who are interested in looking at the heritage and history of the African-American press, which stretches back in continuity to the 1800s, and that African-Americans are utilizing newspapers in the 1800s and the 1900s in order to shine a light on the inequities and on the horrific atrocities that African Americans are experiencing. But what was happening in Chicago as a result of Ebony and Jet and Johnson Communications was key, and not just Johnson Communications, but also the Chicago Defender was critically important. Those companies, as journalistic companies, were a beacon for information for African American communities. They were key even in the movement that we call the Great Migration of African Americans moving out of the South to places like Chicago, Illinois. And they were also key in helping to frame and shape African Americans' expectations of gaining full access to citizenship that they deserved, along with their fellow citizens throughout the United States. So I think that's so important. And it's interesting that in 2020, especially because of the shift from traditional media to social media, that these types of conversations around access to communication still need to happen, because we continue to find that many communities do not have equitable access, and that communities that do have equitable access are finding themselves, may find themselves subject to other concerns like the like the suppression of information by large corporations who now hold so much of our communication access in these towers of power, right? These locations of power, I would call them towers of power, where often communities that are disempowered or who have different viewpoints or different experiences, they find themselves suppressed or censored. There's been a lot of discussion about that, perhaps not in the most public of forums, all through 2020, especially as the pandemic has exposed some of these rifts. So thank you so much for talking about that. And I wanted you too, if you could tell us a bit more about your work in ministry as a person who deals with, in your work as a teaching elder with the Presbyterian Church USA, that you are dealing with anti-racism work, that's a major aspect of what you do, but that you also have found a way, as is obvious in this beautiful work, that you have found a way to make your work as an artist a part of your work as a person in ministry. And it's very clear. It's such a beautiful work. And you do this in a way that is so seamless. I wonder if you could talk about that and your philosophy of your artistry and your ministry and artistry. If you could talk a bit more about that.
Right. Thank you. Well, if we are to believe the account of Scripture and we are to read God's own process of creation, we understand God as an artist anyway. And so I see this natural connection between communicating through fine arts, through visual arts, and preaching. Crafting sermons for me taps into that artistic process that I've been developing for years. Like it made complete sense to me in my homiletics classes as an artist. Like I was creating something. I was creating a piece of art. I was painting a picture. I was rendering something to make, or rather to help people be able to see or understand something a little bit more clearly. And I was going to have to do that having been undergirded by some real scholarship, by paying attention to the world. I could not just throw some strokes on a canvas or some letters on a paper and it just be a thing. I had to bring all of my faculties to it. I had to bring all of myself to it. So I do this work as a minister who works primarily in anti-racism advocacy. I do this work bringing every single discipline I have to it, understanding that all of it is useful. I talked about earlier how I have a background in art, so I got my BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University doing graphic design work. And I had an accidental minor in African American studies, just as the electives that I was taking shaped up to be a minor in African American studies. That then availed itself to my study at Howard University School of Divinity when I was studying for my Master's of Divinity, the degree that is required of me to be an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. And so everything that I learned at VCU was coming into play at Howard. Everything that I learned at VCU and at Howard was coming into play in my ministry. It all has very organically worked together. And I can't really say that that I've consciously done it. It's just sort of shaped up to be that way. And so I just try to pay attention to what is it that I've seen, what is it that I've learned, how then can that be useful to an undertaking. Like the painting is just a way of getting out grief. It was a exercising catharsis for me. But in the process of that catharsis, I could actually say something that would resonate with someone else too. And I mean, that's a gift. Great, fantastic. Let's go with that. I wish I could take more credit for for marrying various disciplines. I've just always found that they made sense to be married and to play well together to me.
How has your because you mentioned in your essays on your website that there has been for you an opportunity to be in community with other artists who also bring their spirituality and their work in ministry to their work. How has that been instrumental? Has it been instrumental in your thinking about these ideas and concepts? And where might we learn more about that?
I have to say that Louisville's art scene is incredibly robust. I'm still new here, but I'm learning so much about it, and so much of what has transpired around our search for justice for Breonna Taylor has involved the arts. Breonna Square, as we call it, has been, it morphed into this art installation. Where you could see in a very powerful way what people were trying to say in the demonstrations that were happening in the aftermath. But also, you know, as we're trained in the arts, I gotta say that a lot of our arts education is deeply colonized and comes from a European perspective, but you at the very least understand the role of religious imagery in European art specifically, and how the church used that as, I guess, devotional tools and as catechism. Art has always been used to teach in some way. So I found it, I mean, and this piece really is in the style of a religious art motif. So I just found it to be a natural extension. But also, you know, I'm theologically trained in the Black liberation tradition. I'm theologically trained in womanist theological thought. And so how I would approach any art would be from a womanist perspective. It would be from a perspective that would censor the experience of the Black woman and our wisdom and our practices and our communal knowledge. And that is the lens through which you're going to hear the story. I'm going to tell it through a Black woman's eyes. The entire community is going to benefit, but the messenger is going to be a Black woman. The message is going to be decidedly related to the experience of Black women. And I think that that's important. That is probably what's missing from our very colonized art education. It is the fact that you can have artistic and religious and hermeneutical expression come from lenses that aren't of the dominant culture, and they can be transformative for the entire world. I hope that answered the question.
And it reminds us to think about a Black liberation theological framework, even as we encounter your pieces. That if we think of the work of James Cone, Crossing the Lynching Tree, if we recognize, so as we can begin to have conversations, and you invite us to think about and to have conversations about Jesus the crucified, as Jesus the lynched man, as right. As we have to encounter and have that conversation when we look at your pieces and we think about the lynching of the child Emmett Till, this young teen boy. Thank you so much for that. And is there anything else that we should be thinking about that you want us to consider and think about?
I think what you just said touched on something. The whole point of this piece is to lift up narratives and perspectives that too often get marginalized, swept off to the side. And if we aren't understanding Emmett Till as Jesus, as a lynched young man, as someone who was killed for no good reason, as a member of a marginalized, occupied group of people, if we can't see that experience, if we cannot make the connections between someone whom so many of us claim to worship and the very people for whom we march in the streets. And I say this as a minister in a predominantly white denomination. If we don't see the connection between Jesus of Nazareth and Emmett Till, between Jesus of Nazareth and Tamir Rice, between Jesus of Nazareth and Tatiana Jefferson, between Jesus of Nazareth and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, if we can't see that connection, we are missing a huge chunk of the message that had been entrusted to us some couple of millennia ago. What we actually worship in the church too often is empire. And what we need to lift is the story of an occupied, oppressed, repressed carpenter teacher who threatened the empire. And that's the reason he was killed. It wasn't just about you and your little sins. He was killed because of what threat he presented. That needs to be made plain.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a wonderful conversation with T.D. Anderson, artist, reverend, and teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. I haven't another question. Thank you so much for what you have taken the time to share with us today. Those who are interested in learning more about T.D. Anderson can check out her website at www.tdandersonart.com. And is there anywhere else we might go to learn more about you and your work in the various arenas in which you find yourself?
I do my ministry within the Presbyterian Mission Agency, which is an agency at the Presbyterian Church USA. And we have a number of resources available at peaceusa.org, at facingracism.org, that talk about the need to do this work from a faith perspective. So it's for church folks, but I think it really has pertinence to all of us.
Mm. Thank you so much, T.D. Anderson, and all the best to you. Thank you so much for this work that you've shared with us, and we just wish you all the best.
Thank you.
I'm your host, Tara Lake. Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with T.D. Anderson about her work, Pietà, Woman, Behold Your Son, Behold Your Mother. More information about Anderson's artwork is available at tdandersonart.com. That's Anderson with an O. Anderson has written a number of essays at solascriptura.com, spelled SOULAScriptura.com. If you're interested in learning more about the Monroe, North Carolina kissing case, a good resource is NAACP activist Robert F. Williams' 1962 book, Negroes with Guns, and the 2004 documentary by the same name. A link to video from this interview can be found at my website at www.taralake.com. That's www.taralake.com. Special thanks to Allison Durham and Brooklyn Fellner for recording support for this project. Thank you so much for listening here at WPPM LP Philadelphia 106.5 FM.